Welcome back to Sleepless History, the podcast where we take the most dramatic, blood-soaked, and suspenseful moments in human history and lay them out, slowly, carefully, and in as much detail as you could ever want, so that you can drift off to sleep. I am your host, and tonight we are going deep. We are going deep into one of the most audacious conspiracies in the history of the English-speaking world. Tonight's episode is about the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. Now, if you grew up in England, or if you have spent any time around English people in early November, you will have some passing familiarity with this story. You will know the name Guy Fawkes. You may have heard the rhyme, "Remember, remember, the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason, and plot." You may have seen the masks, that pale, mustachioed, vaguely sinister face that has, in recent decades, become a symbol of anonymous protest and rebellion, worn by everyone from political activists to people attending comic conventions. But here is what most people do not know. Here is what gets left out of the bonfires and the fireworks and the rhymes and the masks. The story of the Gunpowder Plot is not really the story of Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes was, in many ways, not even the main character. He was the man left holding the matches. He was the technician, the soldier, the man who sat in a cold stone cellar beneath the Houses of Parliament with 36 barrels of gunpowder and waited and waited and waited. The real story is about a man named Robert Catesby, and the real story begins not in 1605, but decades earlier in the smouldering wreckage of a religious revolution that tore England apart at the seams. So let us begin. Let us go back. Let us go all the way back to the world that made these men what they were. A world of priest holes and secret masses, of fines and informers, of faith practiced in whispers behind locked doors, of a country where the religion your grandmother taught you could get you killed. If you've tuned in tonight to help your mind drift off, you're in the right place. That's the reason I create these. If you find this helpful, consider subscribing and leaving a comment about where you're listening from and what the time is. I love reading through the comments. There's something surreal about knowing someone is watching at midnight in San Francisco, while someone else is starting their day in Stockholm or grabbing a quick lunch in Sydney. Chapter 1. A Kingdom Built on Fear. To understand the Gunpowder Plot, you have to understand something that modern audiences sometimes find genuinely difficult to grasp, which is the absolute centrality of religion to everyday life in 16th century England. We live in an age where, for many people in the Western world, religious identity is a private matter, something you practice on your own time, something that sits alongside your political identity rather than defining it entirely. In Tudor and early Stuart England, that was not the case. Religion was everything. Religion determined your loyalty to the crown. Religion determined whether you were a traitor or a patriot. Religion determined whether you could hold public office, attend university, own property freely, or be buried in consecrated ground. Religion was not a private matter. It was a political matter. It was a legal matter. It was, in the most literal sense, a matter of life and death. Now, to understand why Catholics in particular found themselves in such a precarious position, we need to go back to the reign of King Henry VIII, which began in 1509 and lasted until 1547. Henry, as almost everyone knows, broke with the Catholic Church in Rome in the 1530s, primarily, though not entirely, because Pope Clement VII refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. The break was formalised through a series of Acts of Parliament between 1532 and 1536, culminating in the Act of Supremacy of 1534, which declared Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. This was not a small thing. This was not a bureaucratic reshuffling of ecclesiastical paperwork. This was a complete and total rupture with the institution that had been the spiritual centre of English life for nearly 1,000 years. The monasteries were dissolved. Their lands were seized by the crown and redistributed to the nobility, a massive transfer of wealth that gave an enormous number of powerful people a very strong financial incentive to ensure the Reformation stuck. The Pope's authority in England was abolished. Bishops who refused to swear the oath of supremacy were imprisoned or executed. Thomas More, the Lord Chancellor of England and one of the most respected men in the kingdom, was beheaded in 1535 for refusing to acknowledge Henry as the head of the church. And so, almost overnight, England went from being a Catholic country to being a country with its own national church. But here is the thing about religious revolutions: they are not clean. They do not happen overnight in any meaningful sense. You can pass all the legislation you want, but you cannot legislate away centuries of deeply held belief. For a very large portion of the English population, the old faith was not something to be discarded because a king signed a piece of paper. It was something they had grown up with, something their parents and grandparents had practiced, something woven into the very fabric of how they understood the world, how they prayed, how they mourned their dead, how they marked the seasons of the year. When Henry died in 1547, the English Reformation was far from settled. His son, Edward VI, pushed things in a more thoroughly Protestant direction. Then Edward died young in 1553, and his Catholic half-sister Mary took the throne and tried to reverse the whole thing, restoring papal supremacy and burning nearly 300 Protestant men and women at the stake, earning her the historical nickname Bloody Mary. Then Mary died in 1558, and her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth took the throne, and England swung back to Protestantism again. By the time Elizabeth I was crowned at the age of 25, the country had changed its official religion 4 times in less than 30 years. The people of England were exhausted, traumatized, and deeply uncertain about what they were supposed to believe. Elizabeth, to her credit, tried to find a middle path. The so-called Elizabethan settlement of 1559, which established a Church of England that was Protestant in its theology, but retained many of the forms and structures of Catholic worship. The idea was to create a broad enough tent that most English Christians could live under it without feeling like their faith was being entirely destroyed. And for many people, this worked. The Church of England became the established church, and the majority of the English population, whether they retained private Catholic sympathies or not, went along with it. They attended their local parish church. They said the prayers in the Book of Common Prayer. They got on with their lives. But for a significant minority, this was not enough. For those who remained committed to the Catholic faith, who believed in the authority of the Pope, who wanted the Latin Mass, who venerated the saints and the sacraments as they had always been practiced, the Elizabethan settlement was not a compromise. It was a trap. It was a church that looked vaguely familiar, but was, at its heart, heretical, and participating in it, even going through the motions, felt like a betrayal of everything they believed. These people were called recusants. The word comes from the Latin recusare, meaning to refuse. They were the ones who refused to attend Church of England services, refused to take the oath of supremacy, refused to pretend that the Queen of England was the rightful head of the Church of Christ on earth. And the price of that refusal was severe. Under the Elizabethan recusancy laws, which were progressively tightened throughout the 1560s, 70s and 80s, Catholics who refused to attend Protestant church services were subject to fines. Initially, the fines were set at 12 pence per Sunday missed, not nothing, but manageable for wealthy families. Then, in 1581, the fine was increased to £20 per month. £20 per month. To put that in some kind of perspective, £20 in 1581 was roughly equivalent to what a skilled craftsman might earn in an entire year. For most people, it was an impossible sum. For even wealthy families, sustained over years, it was ruinous. And that was, if you got off lightly. The laws went further. Catholics who converted Protestant subjects back to Catholicism were guilty of treason and could be executed. Catholic priests who came to England at all, simply by being present on English soil, were guilty of a felony which meant death. Any person who harboured a Catholic priest was also subject to the death penalty. And informers who turned in recusants and priests were rewarded with a portion of the resulting fines, which meant that there was a thriving, mercenary economy of professional informers who made their living by hunting Catholics. This was the world in which English Catholics lived throughout the reign of Elizabeth I, not openly, not comfortably, but in secret, in the shadows, in a state of constant, low-grade terror. And this is where one of the most extraordinary architectural features of Elizabethan and Jacobean England comes in: the priest hole. A priest hole was exactly what it sounds like. It was a hidden space, concealed within the walls or floors or chimneys or staircases of a house, large enough to hide a person, usually just barely large enough. These spaces were designed and built specifically to conceal Catholic priests from the government searchers, the men who would periodically raid suspected Catholic households looking for evidence of illegal religious practice. The most famous builder of priest holes was a Jesuit lay brother named Nicholas Owen, who is sometimes called Little John in historical accounts because of his small stature. Owen spent roughly 20 years in Elizabethan and Jacobean England, travelling from Catholic house to Catholic house, building hiding spaces of extraordinary ingenuity. He built priest holes inside chimney stacks and behind panelled walls and beneath floor tiles and inside staircases. He built spaces that could only be accessed by moving apparently solid furniture or by removing a section of floor that was indistinguishable from the surrounding boards, or by reaching through a gap in a wall that appeared to be decorative. He built spaces within spaces, double hides, where if searchers found the first concealed room, the priest could already have moved into a second, deeper space that appeared to be a solid wall. Owen understood that the searchers were professionals, that they knew how houses were built, that they would tap walls and measure rooms and look for discrepancies between the dimensions of spaces as viewed from outside and as viewed from within. So he built his priest holes with that knowledge in mind. creating structures of such clever misdirection that some of them were not discovered until centuries later, long after anyone had any reason to be looking for them. And what was life like for the priests who used these spaces? It was not pleasant. We have contemporary accounts from Jesuit priests who described spending days, sometimes more than a week, crouched in priest holes barely large enough to sit up in, without food, without water, without light, without the ability to move or speak, while searchers tore apart the house around them. One priest, Father John Gerard, described a hide at Baddesley Clinton in Warwickshire, where he and 3 other priests spent 4 hours standing in water up to their knees in a drainage channel beneath a trap door, while a search party combed the house above them. He described the cold, the discomfort, and the constant terror of discovery, and he described it with a kind of calm, matter-of-fact courage that is genuinely astonishing to read, because that is what these priests had chosen. They had come to England, come back to England in many cases, having been born there and educated abroad in the English Catholic seminaries on the continent, knowing full well what they were risking. They came because they believed their country needed them. They came because there were thousands of English Catholic families who had no priest, who could not receive the sacraments, who were dying without last rites, whose children were growing up without baptism, whose marriages were unblessed. They came because they believed that the salvation of souls was worth the risk of their own lives, and many of them paid that price. Between 1580 and 1603, the period of Elizabeth's reign that is most relevant to our story, somewhere between 100 and 200 Catholic priests and lay people were executed in England for their faith. They were hanged, drawn, and quartered, a form of execution we will discuss in more detail later in this episode. They died in public, as spectacles, as warnings to others. Now, here is something important to understand about the Elizabethan government's attitude toward English Catholics, because it was not entirely simple and it was not entirely consistent. Elizabeth herself seems to have had relatively little personal enthusiasm for religious persecution. Her famous statement that she had no desire to make windows into men's souls suggests a ruler who was primarily interested in outward conformity and political loyalty rather than genuine theological enforcement. What she wanted was for English Catholics to attend Protestant church services as a demonstration of loyalty to the crown. What she was most afraid of was not Catholics as such, but Catholics as a potential fifth column, a group within England that owed allegiance to a foreign power, namely the Pope in Rome, and that might therefore be a source of instability, rebellion, or invasion. And those fears were not entirely paranoid. In 1570, Pope Pius V issued the papal bull Regnans in Excelsis, which formally excommunicated Elizabeth, declared her a heretic, and, crucially, released all her Catholic subjects from any obligation of loyalty to her. This was, from the English government's perspective, essentially a declaration of war. It told English Catholics that, in the eyes of the Church, they had no duty to obey their Protestant queen. It invited them, implicitly, to support any Catholic power that might seek to overthrow her. The Spanish Armada of 1588 was the most dramatic expression of this threat. King Philip II of Spain, the widower of Queen Mary, the most powerful Catholic monarch in Europe, a man who genuinely believed he was doing God's work, sent a fleet of 130 ships to invade England, depose Elizabeth, and restore the country to Catholicism. The Armada failed, famously, thanks to a combination of bad weather, English sea tactics, and the simple fact that the Spanish plan was an operational disaster. But it confirmed, in the minds of Elizabeth's government, that English Catholics were a potential danger that needed to be controlled, monitored, and if necessary, crushed. And so the cycle continued. The government tightened the laws. Catholics were fined more heavily, hunted more aggressively, executed with more frequency. The community grew more frightened, more resentful, more radicalized. Some of the wealthier families found ways to accommodate. They attended Protestant services while practicing their faith in private. They paid their fines, they kept their heads down and survived. But others refused. Others held on to their faith with a ferocity that grew sharper and more desperate with each passing year. Among those others were the families from which the Gunpowder Plot conspirators would eventually come. Let us talk about a few of those families. The story of the Gunpowder Plot is, in many ways, a story about a specific network of Catholic gentry in the English Midlands. Families who were connected by marriage, by friendship, by shared faith, and by shared suffering. These were not poor people. They were not peasants scraping by on the margins of society. Many of them were from ancient families, families that had been part of the English landowning class for generations, and that, in a way, made their situation more painful rather than less. They had status, they had property, they had the social position that should have given them security and influence, and yet they were treated as second-class subjects, as potential traitors, as people whose faith made them permanently suspect. Robert Catesby came from exactly this background. He was born around 1573, the son of Sir William Catesby and Anne Throckmorton. Both families were deeply Catholic. His father had been imprisoned multiple times for recusancy and had paid enormous fines. Robert grew up watching his family's wealth and security eroded by the constant pressure of the recusancy laws, and he grew up in a community of like-minded people who shared that experience, who knew what it was to be fined, to have their houses searched, to live in constant awareness that their religion made them enemies of the state. He was educated at Oxford, though he left without taking a degree. Taking a degree would have required swearing the oath of supremacy, which he refused to do. He was described by contemporaries as extraordinarily charismatic, physically striking, tall, handsome, well-built, and possessed of a personal magnetism that drew people to him and made them want to follow where he led. He was also, by his late 20s, a man under considerable personal and spiritual strain. His father died in 1598, leaving him with substantial debts and a family estate that the years of recusancy fines had significantly depleted. He had converted to Protestantism briefly. It is unclear whether this was a genuine change of heart or a pragmatic attempt to reduce financial pressure, and then reconverted to Catholicism, which suggests a man wrestling with enormous internal conflict. He also participated in the Essex Rebellion of 1601, a catastrophically ill-judged attempt by Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, to stage a coup against Elizabeth's government. The rebellion collapsed almost immediately. Essex was executed, Catesby was captured, imprisoned, and fined heavily for his participation. He was released, but the experience seems to have hardened something in him. He had risked everything and lost. He had seen that conventional political action was hopeless. He had spent his entire life watching his community ground down by laws that showed no sign of changing. And then, in 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died. The death of Elizabeth I on the 24th of March, 1603, at Richmond Palace, was the end of an era in the most literal sense. She had reigned for 45 years. She had never married, had never produced an heir, and had spent the latter part of her reign stubbornly refusing to name a successor, leaving the question of who would follow her on the throne of England unresolved until almost the very end. The answer, when it came, was James Stuart, James the Sixth of Scotland, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, who had been executed on Elizabeth's orders in 1587. He became James the First of England, and in doing so, united the crowns of England and Scotland in a single monarch for the first time, though the two kingdoms would remain legally separate, with their own parliaments and laws, for another century. For English Catholics, the accession of James I was a moment of intense, fragile hope, and that hope rested on a very specific and very understandable calculation. James's mother, Mary Queen of Scots, had been Catholic. Not just nominally Catholic, but genuinely and devoutly so. It had been, in many ways, the defining fact of her adult life, the thing that had made her such a dangerous figure to Elizabeth's Protestant government. Mary had died a Catholic martyr, beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle with her rosary in her hands, and there were people in England who venerated her as a saint. If James was his mother's son, if he had any of her faith, any of her sympathy for Catholics, then surely his reign would bring some relief. Surely a man whose mother had died for the old faith would not be as zealous in persecuting those who shared it. Surely there was a chance, finally, for some accommodation, some tolerance, some loosening of the grinding laws that had made Catholic life in England so precarious for so long. Some Catholic leaders, including the Jesuit father Henry Garnet, who was the superior of the Jesuit mission in England, and who will appear again significantly later in our story, counselled patience and hope. Messages were sent to James through intermediaries. Assurances were sought, and in the early months of his reign, there were some tentative signs that James might be willing to ease the recusancy fines, if not to grant full religious toleration. But those signs were misleading. James I was a complicated man with a complicated relationship to religion. He had been raised as a Protestant, raised by regents after his mother was deposed when he was barely a year old, raised in Scotland's Calvinist kirk, raised to believe that his mother's Catholicism was not a source of pride, but a source of dangerous instability. He was genuinely interested in theology. He was, in fact, a prolific writer on religious subjects, and he would eventually sponsor the translation of the Bible that bears his name, the King James Bible of 1611, one of the most influential texts in the English language. But interested in theology did not mean tolerant of religious diversity. James believed, as most of his contemporaries believed, that a stable kingdom required religious uniformity. He believed that the Catholic Church's claim of papal supremacy was a direct challenge to his own royal authority, and he was afraid of Catholic plots, deeply, viscerally afraid, in a way that was not entirely irrational, given what had happened to his mother, what had nearly happened with the Armada, and what was to come. By the spring of 1604, it was clear that the hope English Catholics had placed in James was not going to be rewarded. Not only had James not eased the recusancy laws, he had reaffirmed them. In February of 1604, he issued a proclamation ordering all Jesuit priests and other Catholic clergy to leave England, using language that was strikingly harsh. He compared the Catholic Church to a disease, to a cancer, and he made clear that he had no interest in accommodation. The recusancy fines, which had briefly been allowed to lapse in the first months of his reign, were now reimposed with full force. The brief window of hope slammed shut. For men like Robert Catesby, this was not just a disappointment, it was the last disappointment. It was the proof, the final, definitive proof, that there was no legal, political, or peaceful path to relief for English Catholics. Every avenue had been tried. Every hope had been raised and dashed. And Catesby, who had been turning an idea over in his mind for months, perhaps longer, decided that the time for half measures was over. The idea was breathtaking in its audacity. It was terrifying in its potential consequences. And it was, in retrospect, almost certainly doomed from the start. But in the spring of 1604, in a house in the Strand in London, Robert Catesby sat down with a small group of trusted friends and laid it out. He was going to blow up the Houses of Parliament. Not just the building, not just the chamber. He was going to wait until the king himself was present, until the state opening of Parliament brought together in one place the king, the lords, the commons, essentially the entire governing structure of Protestant England. And then he was going to detonate enough gunpowder beneath the chamber to destroy it all in a single catastrophic explosion. And in the chaos that followed, with the government destroyed and the Protestant ruling class in disarray, the Catholics of England would rise up. They would take power. They would restore the true faith. They would, in Catesby's vision, transform England overnight from a Protestant kingdom into a Catholic one. That was the plan. That was the Gunpowder Plot. And the first man Catesby told was a young gentleman named Thomas Wintour. Thomas Wintour was 30 years old in 1604, a younger son of a Catholic gentry family from Worcestershire, educated in part on the continent, experienced in European politics and war. He was, by all accounts, a careful, intelligent, methodical man, a useful counterbalance to Catesby's visionary intensity. When Catesby first outlined the plan to him, Wintour's initial response was cautious. He pointed out the obvious practical difficulties. He worried about the harm that such an action might do to Catholics themselves, both those who might be caught up in the explosion and those who would face inevitable reprisals afterward. But Catesby was persuasive. He had a quality that the historical record returns to again and again, an ability to make people believe that what he was proposing was not only possible but righteous, not only daring but divinely sanctioned. He argued that the suffering of English Catholics had gone on long enough. He argued that conventional means had been exhausted. He argued, using the theological concept of double effect, that it was morally permissible to kill those who happened to be present alongside the intended targets, when the greater good being served was the liberation of an entire community of the faithful. Wintour was convinced, and his first practical contribution to the conspiracy was to travel to Flanders, to the Spanish Netherlands, where England and Spain had been fighting a low-grade proxy war for years to seek support from the Spanish government and, more importantly, to make contact with a man whose military expertise would prove essential to the plan. That man was Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes was born in York in 1570. the son of a Protestant father, Edward Fawkes, a proctor and advocate of the church courts. His father died when Guy was around 8 years old, and his mother subsequently remarried a Catholic gentleman named Dennis Bainbridge, which brought the young Guy Fawkes into contact with the recusant Catholic community in Yorkshire. Whether he was raised Catholic or converted as a young man is somewhat unclear in the historical record, but by his early 20s, Fawkes had become a committed Catholic and had made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He sold his share of his father's estate in Yorkshire and travelled to the continent to serve in the Spanish army in Flanders. For the next decade and more, Guy Fawkes served as a professional soldier in one of the most experienced and technically advanced military forces in Europe. He fought in the long, grinding wars of the Low Countries. He developed expertise in military engineering, in the digging of mines, the setting of explosive charges, the technical business of demolition warfare, which was a significant part of how sieges were conducted in the late 16th century. He rose to the rank of an officer, and he was described by those who knew him as a man of remarkable physical courage, steady nerves, and quiet, intense conviction. He was also, by this point, known in certain circles as an English Catholic exile who might be useful to those seeking Spanish support for operations against the Protestant English government. He had, in fact, petitioned the Spanish government himself at various points, seeking backing for a Catholic uprising in England, petitions that had come to nothing. When Thomas Wintour arrived in Flanders in the spring of 1604 looking for a man with military and explosives expertise, Fawkes was exactly the person he was looking for. Wintour met Fawkes, explained the broad outlines of the plot, not all the details, but enough, and Fawkes agreed to return to England. He changed his name for the purpose of the conspiracy, going by the alias John Johnson, and sailed back to a country he had not seen for years to play his part in the most dangerous operation of his life. By late May of 1604, the core group of conspirators had taken shape: Catesby, Wintour, Fawkes, and 2 more men, John Wright, Catesby's childhood friend, and one of the most skilled swordsmen in England, and Thomas Percy, a distant relative of the Earl of Northumberland, and a man who had access to influential circles that would prove operationally crucial. The 5 of them, Catesby, Wintour, Fawkes, Wright, and Percy, met in a house near the Strand in London in late May 1604. They swore an oath of secrecy on a prayer book, and then they knelt together and received communion from a Catholic priest, Father John Gerard, who had no knowledge of what the men had just sworn to do. The Gunpowder Plot had officially begun. Chapter 2: The Mechanics of Destruction. Let me pause here for a moment and invite you, if you have not already, to settle in more comfortably, adjust your pillow, pull the blanket up, because we are about to spend some time in the operational details of the plot, the how, the who, the logistics of trying to move 2,500 kilograms of gunpowder across the River Thames by night without anyone noticing. This is the part of the story where the grand, almost abstract ambition of the conspirators collides with the extremely concrete, extremely frustrating reality of trying to carry out an enormously complex operation in secret in a city full of eyes and ears and informers. The first practical problem the conspirators faced was proximity. In order to blow up the House of Lords, you needed to get a very large amount of explosive material into a space directly beneath or adjacent to it. And in order to do that, you needed to be physically present in the Palace of Westminster, which was not a place where random Catholic gentlemen could simply stroll around at will. Thomas Percy solved this problem, at least initially. Percy was, as I mentioned, a distant relation of the Earl of Northumberland, and through that connection he was appointed as a gentleman pensioner, essentially a member of the royal bodyguard, which gave him legitimate access to the Palace of Westminster and its surroundings. More importantly, he used his position to rent a small house that abutted the House of Lords. The house, which was close to the southern end of the Parliament building, gave the conspirators a base from which they could work. The plan, in its original form, was to dig a tunnel. They would begin in the cellar of Percy's rented house and tunnel horizontally beneath the foundations of the House of Lords, creating an underground passage through which they could carry the gunpowder to a position directly beneath the chamber where Parliament met. This was not a crazy idea. Mining and tunnelling was a well-established military technique for undermining fortifications, and the conspirators had in Guy Fawkes someone with genuine expertise in exactly this kind of work. But it was, to put it mildly, hard work. The ground beneath the Palace of Westminster was not soft London clay, it was, in parts, solid stone. The conspirators had to work in cramped, poorly lit conditions, in almost complete silence, making as little noise as possible to avoid attracting attention from the people living and working in the buildings around them. They could only work at certain hours. They had to dispose of the excavated earth and stone without anyone noticing. And they had to do all of this while maintaining the fiction that they were ordinary tenants going about their ordinary business. They worked through the autumn and winter of 1604 and into 1605. The tunnel progressed, slowly and painfully. But then something happened that seemed, at the time, like a remarkable stroke of fortune. A coal merchant who had a vault, a storage cellar, directly beneath the House of Lords decided, for whatever reason, to leave his tenancy. The vault became available to let, and Thomas Percy, moving quickly, arranged to rent it. Just like that, the tunnel became unnecessary. The vault, which is usually referred to in the historical accounts as the Undercroft, was not directly beneath the chamber where the Lord sat, but it was close enough. It was a stone-vaulted cellar space at ground level, running beneath the first-floor chamber of the House of Lords used for storage. It was cluttered with lumber and coal and general rubbish. It was not particularly well supervised, and it was connected to the outside world through an entrance that the conspirators could use to bring in supplies. It was, in short, perfect. Now, here I want to address something that has been debated by historians for quite a long time, which is the question of whether the tunnel story is actually true. The tunnel was supposedly discovered after the plot was uncovered, but no physical evidence of it has ever been conclusively identified. Some historians believe it was entirely fabricated, that the government invented the tunnel story after the fact to make the plot seem even more dramatic and carefully planned, and to justify the severity of the response. Others believe the tunnel was real, but has simply not survived in an identifiable form given the many subsequent modifications to the Palace of Westminster. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that by the spring of 1605, the conspirators had secured the Undercroft beneath the House of Lords and were using it for storage. Whether they got there via a tunnel or directly via a rental agreement or both, they were there. And now the question of what to put in it became urgent. The answer was gunpowder. Lots and lots of gunpowder. The conspirators needed to acquire their gunpowder carefully. They could not simply walk into a shop and purchase 2,500 kilograms of the stuff that would have attracted exactly the kind of attention they were trying to avoid. Gunpowder was also in this period a controlled substance in England. It was manufactured by the government for military purposes, and private purchase of large quantities required explanation and justification. The exact details of how the conspirators acquired their gunpowder have never been entirely established. What we know is that the barrels were transported by boat, crossing the Thames, presumably from a storage location on the south bank, and landing at the Westminster Stairs. The Thames was, in this period, the main highway of London, crowded with boats of all sizes, and a small number of barrels moved at night under the cover of darkness, and wrapped to look like coal or other innocuous cargo, would not necessarily have attracted attention. 36 barrels. That is the number that appears in the historical record. 36 barrels of gunpowder, containing in total approximately 2,500 kilograms, roughly 2.5 tons, of what was one of the most powerful explosive substances available in 1605. To give you a sense of what that means in practical terms, a single musket charge of the period used perhaps a few grams of gunpowder. A cannon charge might use a pound or two. The largest mines used in military sieges during this period might employ 50 to 100 kilograms. The conspirators were planning to detonate 25 to 50 times that amount in an enclosed stone space directly beneath one of the largest timber-framed buildings in England. Had it detonated as planned, the explosion would have been catastrophic. Modern engineers who have analysed the scenario estimate that the blast radius would have been enormous, that buildings within a significant distance of the Parliament building would have been severely damaged or destroyed, that the fireball and concussion would have been lethal for anyone within a wide area, and that the resulting fire would almost certainly have spread to consume much of the surrounding city. The conspirators knew this. They had calculated it, or at least made rough estimates, and they had taken some precautions to try to protect certain individuals from the blast, most notably by arranging for some Catholic peers to be warned away from the opening of Parliament. But the scale of the intended killing was still enormous, and this is something that weighs on any historical account of the plot. These were not men planning a targeted political assassination. They were planning what would, in modern terminology, be called a weapon of mass destruction attack on the political heart of a nation. How did they justify this to themselves? We have, thanks to Thomas Wintour's confession and various other documents that survive from after the plot was discovered, some insight into the conspirators' internal discussions. There were, apparently, moments of doubt. Some of the men raised concerns about the Catholic peers who would be present at the state opening of Parliament and who would inevitably die in the explosion. Catesby's response, as reported by Wintour, was essentially that the good of the many, the liberation of England's Catholic community, outweighed the loss of a few Catholic nobles who had, in any case, compromised their faith by serving in a Protestant government. There was also a broader question about what would happen after the explosion. The conspirators had a plan of a sort. In the immediate aftermath of the blast, while the government was in chaos, and before any organised response could be mounted, a group of Catholic gentlemen in the Midlands would rise up in arms. They would seize the person of Princess Elizabeth, James's 9-year-old daughter, who they planned to install as a Catholic puppet queen, and begin the process of restoring Catholic governance to England. It was, to put it as gently as possible, an optimistic plan. It relied on an enormous number of things going right, on the explosion actually working, on the Catholic community rising up on cue, on the Protestant nobility being too shocked and disorganised to respond effectively, on foreign Catholic powers providing support. It relied on a population that had, by and large, spent decades finding ways to accommodate Protestant rule, suddenly deciding to take up arms for a faith that many of them practiced only in secret and at great personal risk. But the conspirators believed it, or at least Catesby believed it, and his belief was persuasive enough to sustain the others through the long months of preparation. Because by the summer of 1605, the group had grown significantly larger than its original 5 members. Catesby had recruited additional conspirators, each one brought into the secret carefully, sworn to secrecy, given a specific role. Let me introduce you to the full cast of the Gunpowder Plot, because each of them has a story worth knowing. Thomas Wintour you already know, the careful, methodical man from Worcestershire who had brought Fawkes into the conspiracy. He had a brother, Robert Wintour, who was also recruited and who would play a role in the aftermath of the plot's failure. John Wright you also know, Catesby's childhood friend, the swordsman. He too had a brother, Christopher Wright, who was brought in. Thomas Percy you know as well, the royal bodyguard with access to Westminster, the man who rented the Undercroft. Guy Fawkes, John Johnson, the military expert, the man who would actually manage the gunpowder in the cellar and light the fuse at the appointed time. Then there was Robert Keyes, a Catholic gentleman who served as something of a general logistics manager for the conspiracy, responsible for keeping the gunpowder stored safely at various locations before it was moved to the Undercroft. Francis Tresham was one of the later recruits, and he is a crucial figure for reasons we will discuss in the next chapter. He was a wealthy Catholic gentleman, a cousin of Robert Catesby and Thomas Wintour, and his recruitment was partly motivated by the conspirators' need for money. The plot was expensive, renting houses, buying gunpowder, maintaining the cover stories, and Tresham had resources. Ambrose Rookwood was another wealthy recruit, brought in partly for his resources and partly because he owned fast horses, crucial for the planned escape and uprising after the explosion. Sir Everard Digby was a young, wealthy, idealistic Catholic gentleman who was recruited to lead the Midlands uprising that was supposed to follow the explosion. He was 24 years old, had a young wife and children, and was by most accounts a genuinely decent and devout man who had been swept up in Catesby's vision of liberation. John Grant was a Catholic gentleman from Warwickshire, quiet and determined. Thomas Bates was Catesby's personal servant, brought into the conspiracy, somewhat controversially, because Catesby had inadvertently revealed enough that Bates had guessed at the plan, and it seemed safer to include him than to leave him as an unknowing partial witness. Robert Wintour, Christopher Wright, Robert Keyes, Francis Tresham, Ambrose Rookwood, Everard Digby, John Grant, Thomas Bates, together with Catesby, the 2 Wintours, the 2 Wrights, Percy and Fawkes, these men formed the 13 conspirators of the Gunpowder Plot. 13 men, 13 Catholics, 13 people who believed, with varying degrees of certainty and various degrees of moral discomfort, that what they were doing was justified, that it was necessary, that it was, perhaps, even God's will, and throughout the summer of 1605, as the date of the state opening of Parliament approached, they held their nerve, they maintained their secrecy, they kept their story straight, or most of them did. One man kept a secret within the secret, a secret that would, in the end, unravel everything. By the summer of 1605, the conspirators had all 36 barrels of gunpowder in the Undercroft, concealed beneath a covering of lumber and coal, the kind of ordinary detritus that a coal merchant's vault might legitimately contain. Guy Fawkes, in his alias as John Johnson, posed as Percy's manservant and was nominally in charge of the vault, which gave him a reason to be present there without arousing suspicion. The date for the state opening of Parliament was originally set for February of 1605, then postponed. There was an outbreak of plague in London, as there so often was in this period, and the opening was pushed back to the 3rd of October. Then it was pushed back again to the 5th of November. Each delay created its own anxieties and risks. The conspirators had to maintain their cover stories for longer. The gunpowder, stored in a stone cellar beneath a building in the damp English climate, had to be kept dry and in good condition. The circle of those who knew had grown wider than was comfortable. There was a specific anxiety about the gunpowder itself. Gunpowder of this period was not a stable, inert substance. It was a mixture of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulphur, and it could be affected by moisture, by heat, by the mere fact of sitting in a barrel for an extended period. The ingredients could separate what was called corning or decaying, rendering the mixture less effective or, in some cases, potentially dangerous to handle. At some point, the conspirators apparently attempted to refresh or replace some of their supply, though the details are unclear. The date, November the 5th of 1605, was eventually confirmed. The state opening of Parliament was scheduled for that morning. King James would be there, the Lords would be there, the Commons would be there. Everything was in place. And then, on the evening of October the 26th, a letter arrived at the house of Lord Monteagle. Chapter 3. The Letter and the Lantern. William Parker, 4th Baron Monteagle, was a Catholic, or at least he had been raised Catholic and had Catholic sympathies and Catholic family connections. He was also a man who had made his peace with the Protestant establishment, who sat in the House of Lords, who had served the government in various capacities, and who was, by 1605, navigating that complicated middle ground that many English Catholics of the period occupied, loyal enough to the crown to survive, Catholic enough to maintain his community connections. On the evening of October the 26th, 1605, about 10 days before the planned state opening of Parliament, a servant of Lord Monteagle was approached on his way to his master's house in Hoxton by an unknown man who pressed a letter into his hands and disappeared into the dark. The servant brought the letter to Monteagle. Monteagle had the letter read aloud to him by one of his attendants. It has been suggested, though not confirmed, that Monteagle himself may not have been fully literate, which was less unusual among the nobility of the period than you might expect. The letter read, in the somewhat archaic English of the time, as follows, and I will read it out to you now, spelling modernized for clarity. My lord, out of the love I bear to some of your friends, I have a care of your preservation. Therefore, I would advise you, as you tender your life, to devise some excuse to shift of your attendance at this Parliament. For God and man have concurred to punish the wickedness of this time. And think not slightly of this advertisement, but retire yourself into your country, where you may expect the event in safety. For though there be no appearance of any stir, yet I say they shall receive a terrible blow this Parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them. This counsel is not to be contemned, because it may do you good, and can do you no harm. For the danger is past, as soon as you have burnt the letter. And I hope God will give you the grace to make good use of it, to whose holy protection I commend you. That is the Monteagle letter, and it is one of the most analysed documents in English history, for reasons that will become clear. Monteagle, having had the letter read to him, did not burn it as instructed. Instead, according to the official account of events, he immediately took it to Whitehall Palace and delivered it to Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury, who was the King's chief minister and the man responsible for intelligence and state security. Cecil read it, consulted with several other members of the Privy Council, and decided again, according to the official account, to wait before acting, to allow the plot to develop further before intervening, in order to catch the conspirators in flagrante. That, at least, is the official story. But the Monteagle letter has generated more historical controversy than almost any other document connected to the Gunpowder Plot, and the central question, a question that has never been definitively answered, is: who wrote it? The conspirators themselves apparently suspected Francis Tresham, who was Monteagle's brother-in-law and who had access to information about the plot. Tresham denied it vehemently when confronted by Catesby and others, and continued to deny it until his death in the Tower of London in December 1605. But his denial was not entirely convincing to his fellow conspirators, and it has not been entirely convincing to subsequent historians either. Other candidates have been proposed. Some historians have suggested that the letter was written by one of the other conspirators, Thomas Wintour's brother Robert, or Everard Digby's wife, or any of several other people who may have had partial knowledge of the plot. There are also theories, perhaps the most dramatic and cynically persuasive, that the letter was not written by anyone within the conspiracy at all, but was fabricated by Robert Cecil's intelligence service, which had its own informants and may have been aware of the plot long before the letter arrived. This theory, the Cecil knew theory, has a certain dark elegance to it. Cecil was one of the most skilled political operators of the era, a man who had built and maintained his position at the centre of English power through a combination of genuine administrative talent and ruthless intelligence work. If Cecil's informants had penetrated the conspiracy months earlier, he would have had strong reasons to let it run, to allow the conspirators to gather their resources and commit themselves fully before swooping in order to produce the most dramatic and politically useful outcome. A failed plot, dramatically uncovered at the last moment, with the king's life apparently saved by providential intervention, would be far more valuable politically than a conspiracy arrested quietly at an early stage on the basis of informant reports. There is, it must be said, no definitive evidence that Cecil fabricated the letter or that the government knew about the plot significantly earlier than the official account suggests. The historical consensus is probably that the letter was written by someone within the conspiracy's circle, possibly Tresham, possibly someone else, out of a genuine desire to warn Monteagle without directly betraying their co-conspirators. The terrible blow and shall not see who hurts them language is consistent with someone who wanted to convey danger without specifying the exact nature of the plot. But the ambiguity remains. And it matters because the question of who wrote the letter is also the question of who betrayed the conspiracy, and whether that betrayal came from inside the group or from a government that had been watching all along. When word reached the conspirators that a letter had been sent to Monteagle, and word did reach them almost immediately, because Catesby apparently had his own sources of information about what was circulating in Catholic circles in London, the response was not unanimous. Some of the conspirators, particularly Thomas Wintour, were alarmed enough to suggest abandoning the plot immediately. If a warning had been given, the government would investigate. If the government investigated, the Undercroft would be searched. If the Undercroft was searched, they were finished. But Catesby refused to abandon the plan. He argued that the letter was vague enough that it might be dismissed. He argued that if the government had serious information, they would have acted already rather than waiting. He argued that God would not have brought them this far only to let them fail. He was, by this point, so wholly committed to his vision that the thought of withdrawal was apparently psychologically intolerable. And so the conspiracy continued. Guy Fawkes remained in the Undercroft with the gunpowder. The other conspirators maintained their positions. November the 5th drew closer. What Catesby did not know, or perhaps at some level refused to believe, was that the government was, in fact, acting, not quickly and openly, but carefully and methodically, precisely as Robert Cecil would have wanted. The evening of November the 4th, one day before the planned state opening of Parliament, the Privy Council had debated through the night of the 26th and into the following days about what to do with the letter. They had brought it to King James, who had apparently read it himself and drawn the conclusion, or been guided to draw the conclusion, that the terrible blow referred to an explosive mine of some kind. This was not an unreasonable inference, and James may have been more inclined to make it than others given his awareness of earlier plots involving similar methods. The decision was made to search the Palace of Westminster, but the search, when it came, was conducted in a way that was almost theatrical in its deliberateness. The first search of the Undercroft took place on the afternoon of November the 4th. It was led by a gentleman named Thomas Knivet, a magistrate and gentleman of the bedchamber, acting on orders from the Privy Council. Knivet and a small group of men entered the Undercroft and found it dark and filled with what appeared to be coal and lumber. They also found a man standing there, Guy Fawkes, in his guise as John Johnson, describing himself as a servant of Thomas Percy acting as a caretaker for the stored materials. And here is the almost incomprehensible thing. They let him go. The first search party left. They reported back to their superiors. Something about the encounter, the quantity of the stored materials perhaps, or the man's demeanour, or simply the gut instinct of experienced investigators, prompted the decision to search again, more thoroughly, later that night. Why did they let him go the first time? This question has been asked by historians ever since, and the most plausible answer is that they were following a deliberate strategy of allowing the conspirator the chance to incriminate himself more completely. If they arrested Fawkes before midnight, they had a man who might be able to explain away the gunpowder as innocent stored fuel. If they waited and found him with the means to ignite it, the case was unanswerable. That is one interpretation. Another is that the searchers genuinely missed the significance of what they had found, that the barrels, covered in coal, did not immediately suggest gunpowder, and that only further discussion and analysis led to the conclusion that a second, more thorough search was necessary. Whatever the reason, the second search was conducted after midnight, in the very early hours of November the 5th. Knivett returned to the Undercroft with a larger party. They found Guy Fawkes again. He was dressed in a dark cloak. He was wearing boots and spurs. He was ready to ride, to get away from the area as quickly as possible after lighting the fuse. And in his pockets they found a slow match, a length of specially treated cord used to ignite gunpowder fuses, and a quantity of touchwood, which is a type of fungal material that catches a spark and holds it smouldering, used in the same way. The coal and lumber were pulled aside. The barrels beneath were examined. 36 barrels of gunpowder. Guy Fawkes was arrested on the spot. The arrest of Guy Fawkes in the early hours of November the 5th, 1605, is one of the most famous moments in British history. The annual celebration that takes place on the 5th of November in England, Bonfire Night, or Guy Fawkes Night, commemorates this moment. Effigies of Fawkes are burned, fireworks are set off. Children carry their stuffed guys through the streets. The whole tradition is essentially a 400-year-old victory celebration, the moment the government of England was saved from destruction. But at the moment of his arrest, the celebrations were still a long way off. What followed for Guy Fawkes was a night and a morning, and then days of interrogation. And his behaviour during that interrogation tells us something important about the kind of man he was. He gave his name as John Johnson. He said he was a servant of Thomas Percy. He said the gunpowder in the cellar was his master's property, and that he, as a servant, had been asked to guard it. He revealed nothing of substance. He was described by those present at his initial examination as composedly indifferent to his situation, not defiant in a dramatic, shouting way, but quietly, almost serenely unmoved. He was taken to the king's private chambers at Whitehall, where King James himself apparently interviewed him briefly. It was during this encounter, or possibly during a subsequent official examination, that Fawkes reportedly made the remark that has attached itself to his legend ever since. When asked why he had such a large quantity of gunpowder in his possession, he replied, in words that appear in various slightly different forms in different contemporary accounts, words to the effect of needing it to blow back the Scotch beggars to their native mountains. This was a reference to the king and to the considerable number of Scottish courtiers who had accompanied James south when he took the English throne, a source of considerable resentment among the English nobility. James, apparently, was not amused, but he may have been, on some level, grudgingly impressed. Contemporary accounts suggest he described Fawkes as possessing a Roman resolution, meaning the stoic courage of a classical Roman facing death. Fawkes was sent to the Tower of London, and there the interrogations became rather more serious. King James signed a warrant authorising the use of torture, beginning, as the warrant specified, with the milder instruments and progressing to the more severe if the prisoner did not cooperate. This was, legally and technically, within the king's prerogative in cases of treason, though torture was otherwise illegal under English common law and was relatively rarely used. The specific instruments authorised are not described in detail in the surviving documents, but the Tower of London had, by this period, a well-established infrastructure for this purpose, including a device called the manacles, a form of strappado in which the prisoners' wrists were bound behind their back and they were suspended from them, and the rack. Fawkes held out for 2 days. His examinations from the 6th and 7th of November show him stonewalling, giving minimal information, protecting his co-conspirators. But by the 8th of November, the combination of physical and psychological pressure had its effect. He began to talk. His confession on the 8th of November confirmed the existence of the plot, named some of his co-conspirators, and described the general outline of the plan. But even then, even after days of what must have been severe physical suffering, Fawkes showed a kind of care in what he revealed. He held back certain information. He was not, even under torture, entirely forthcoming. His signature on the examinations tells its own story. The signature from the 7th of November, early in the interrogation, is a bold, clear, confident hand, slightly shaky but recognizable. By the final examinations, the signature has shrunk to barely legible scratching, tiny, trembling marks that speak to what had been done to his body. Guy Fawkes, whatever one thinks of the cause he served and the method he chose, was not a coward. He endured what was done to him with a fortitude that his interrogators acknowledged and that even his enemies respected. Meanwhile, the rest of the conspiracy was coming apart. The news of the arrests spread quickly through London and then outward into the country. The conspirators outside the capital, those who had been waiting for news, waiting for the explosion that would signal the beginning of the uprising, received the news in fragments, confused and terrifying. Something had gone wrong. Fawkes was taken. The plot had failed. What happened next among the surviving conspirators reveals something important about the difference between the rational and the visionary. The rational response to the failure of the plot would have been to disperse, to scatter, to burn incriminating documents, to disappear into the countryside or onto ships bound for the continent, to make oneself as hard to find as possible and wait for the storm to pass. Some of the conspirators did, effectively, attempt something like this. Francis Tresham, for instance, made no attempt to join the others in the Midlands and instead remained in London, where he was subsequently arrested. Thomas Wintour initially separated from the group and then rejoined them, a decision that would contribute to his eventual capture. But Robert Catesby did not run. He could not run. The vision that had sustained him for more than a year, the burning conviction that this was God's will and that he was the instrument of English Catholic liberation, he could not simply abandon it because one element of the plan had failed. He gathered what remained of the conspiracy and he rode north. Chapter 4. The Riders and the Reckoning. On the morning of November the 5th, 1605, while Guy Fawkes was being interrogated in a room at the Palace of Whitehall, Robert Catesby was already riding. He had received the news of the failed plot in the early hours, and his response was not to flee, but to mobilise. He rode hard through the night toward Warwickshire, toward the Midlands, toward the estates of Catholic gentry, and the network of sympathisers who were supposed to rise up in support of the plot. With him rode Thomas Percy, John and Christopher Wright, Ambrose Rookwood, Everard Digby, and a handful of other men. They made for Dunchurch, in Warwickshire, where Everard Digby had assembled a group of men under the pretext of a hunting party, the cover story for what was supposed to be the beginning of the Catholic uprising. Digby had gathered somewhere between 50 and 100 men at Dunchurch, men who had been told they were there for hunting, but who Digby planned to reveal after the explosion as the first wave of the Catholic insurgency. But when Digby arrived at Dunchurch and announced that the plot had failed, that Fawkes had been arrested, that the gunpowder had not exploded, the response was not what he had hoped. Most of the men, understandably, did not want to continue. Some of them left immediately. The hunting party dissolved into confusion and recrimination. Catesby's response to this was to keep moving. He believed, or told himself he believed, that if he could just reach more people, if he could gather enough force, if he could find enough Catholic supporters willing to take up arms, the uprising could still succeed. He led the remaining conspirators westward, raiding local Catholic houses for horses and weapons and provisions as they went, in a desperate attempt to build a force capable of doing something. The historical record is not entirely clear on what, exactly, Catesby thought he could accomplish at this point, with a dwindling band of armed men being pursued by the government. The route they took went through Warwickshire and into Worcestershire and then into Staffordshire, arriving eventually at a manor house called Holbeche House near the village of Kingswinford in Staffordshire. Holbeche House was the property of a member of the Catholic gentry, and it became the final refuge of the surviving conspirators. But even before the government caught up with them, disaster struck in a manner so ironic that it would be funny if the stakes were not so high. Among the supplies that the conspirators had taken or purchased during their flight was a quantity of gunpowder. They had been carrying it with them on the road, and it had gotten wet, the weather in early November in England being what it is. They decided to dry it out by spreading it before the fire in the great hall of Holbeche House. This is, as anyone with any knowledge of gunpowder would tell you, an extraordinarily bad idea. Gunpowder, when dried out in front of an open fire by people who are exhausted, terrified, and not thinking entirely clearly, has a tendency to ignite, which is exactly what happened. The gunpowder caught fire. There was an explosion, smaller than the one they had been planning for the House of Lords, but significant enough. Several of the conspirators were injured. Catesby himself was burned, though not severely. John Grant was badly burned and was partially blinded. A religious novice named Stephen Littleton, who had been sheltering with the group, had his face burned. The conspiracy that had been built on gunpowder was now, in its final hours, undone in part by gunpowder. The symbolism is almost too neat to be believed. By the morning of November the 8th, 3 days after the failed plot, the government's agents had tracked the conspirators to Holbeche House. A sheriff's posse, a force of 200 men under the Sheriff of Worcestershire, Richard Walsh, surrounded the building. What followed was a brief, violent confrontation. The conspirators who remained, Catesby, Percy, the two Wrights, and a handful of others, made no attempt to surrender. Whether this was defiance, despair, or simply the recognition that surrender meant a worse death than fighting, we cannot know. They came out of the house and met the sheriff's men in the courtyard. In the exchange of gunfire that followed, John Wright was shot and killed. Christopher Wright was shot and killed. Thomas Percy was shot, some accounts say by the same ball that killed Thomas Percy's companion and died of his wounds shortly afterward. Robert Catesby was shot. The accounts of Catesby's death vary slightly. In most versions, he was shot from behind by a member of the sheriff's posse. He was struck by a musket ball and fell, mortally wounded. He dragged himself back into the house. He was found inside, dying, clutching a picture of the Virgin Mary. He died within hours. Robert Catesby, the charismatic, visionary, radicalized man who had conceived the Gunpowder Plot, who had convinced 13 men to commit treason and risk their lives for his dream of Catholic liberation, died at Holbeche House on November the 8th, 1605, before he could be arrested, tried, or executed. The others were not so fortunate, or, depending on how you look at it, not so lucky. Thomas Wintour was captured at Holbeche House, wounded. Everard Digby was captured nearby, having fled the house before the assault. Ambrose Rookwood was captured. John Grant, half blinded by the gunpowder accident, was captured. Robert Wintour managed to escape the immediate situation and evaded capture for several weeks before being taken. Thomas Bates was captured. Robert Keyes was captured. Francis Tresham, who had remained in London, was arrested there and taken to the Tower. He died in the Tower in December 1605 of what was reported as a urinary complaint. Whether this was natural illness accelerated by imprisonment or something more sinister has been debated. He was reportedly at great pains during his final days to deny that he had written the Monteagle letter. The surviving conspirators were brought to London, to the Tower, and to the formal process of the law. And at this point, let us also return to two men who were not conspirators themselves, but whose fates were bound up in the plot's aftermath, Father Henry Garnet and Father Oswald Tessimond, two Jesuit priests who had known, at least in general terms, of the conspirators' intentions. Father Tessimond had heard in the confessional from Thomas Wintour or another conspirator something about the plot's nature and had subsequently told Father Garnet. The confessional seal is, in Catholic theology, absolute. A priest cannot reveal what is said to him in confession under any circumstances, regardless of consequences. And Garnet, bound by that seal, had not gone to the authorities. He had urged the conspirators through intermediaries to abandon their plans and had prayed that they would, but he had not betrayed the confession. For the English government, this was treason. Father Garnet was hunted down. He was found hiding in a priest hole at Hindlip Hall in Worcestershire, where he had been concealed for more than a week with almost nothing to eat or drink, and brought to London. He was tried, convicted, and executed in May of 1606. Father Tessimond escaped to the continent and lived there for the rest of his life, dying in Naples in 1635. Nicholas Owen, the master builder of priest holes, was also captured at Hindlip Hall. He was taken to the Tower and subjected to severe torture. He refused to give information. He died under interrogation on March the 2nd, 1606, officially recorded as having died of a stomach rupture, though the circumstances strongly suggest that the torture contributed to or directly caused his death. He was beatified by Pope Paul VI in 1970 as one of the 40 martyrs of England and Wales. The trial of the surviving conspirators, those who had not died at Holbeche House or in the Tower, took place on January the 27th, 1606, at Westminster Hall. It was, as state trials of this period tended to be, something of a theatre rather than a genuine exercise in impartial justice. The outcome was never in doubt. The confessions had been obtained. The evidence was overwhelming. The question was not whether the men were guilty, but how the process of conviction and execution would unfold, and what political messages the government intended to send through it. The conspirators were tried together as a group. They were arraigned on charges of high treason. The evidence against them was presented, the confessions, the testimony of witnesses, the physical evidence of the gunpowder, and the equipment found in the Undercroft. The Attorney General, Sir Edward Coke, delivered an opening address of extraordinary vitriol, describing the conspirators in terms designed to maximize public horror and outrage. Most of the surviving conspirators entered pleas of guilty. Everard Digby, who had not been present in London for the actual plot and whose involvement was more peripheral, tried to argue some distinctions, tried to suggest that his participation had been limited and his intentions less murderous than those of the central figures. The court was unmoved. Thomas Wintour, who had been one of the plot's architects from the beginning, was composed and straightforward, acknowledging his guilt and making no attempt at mitigation. Guy Fawkes, still recovering from the effects of his imprisonment and torture, was described as weak in body but clear in mind. All 8 of the surviving conspirators, Thomas Wintour, Everard Digby, Robert Wintour, John Grant, Ambrose Rookwood, Robert Keyes, Thomas Bates, and Guy Fawkes, were convicted of high treason and sentenced to death. The sentence was the traditional English sentence for high treason, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This penalty deserves some explanation, because it was specifically designed to be as degrading and painful as possible, and because understanding it is important to understanding the full horror of what the conspirators faced. A person condemned to be hanged, drawn and quartered was first dragged through the streets on a hurdle, a wooden frame, from the place of their imprisonment to the place of their execution. This was the drawn part of the sentence, and it served the dual purpose of physically exhausting the condemned and exposing them to public humiliation along the route. Crowds would gather to jeer, to throw things, to watch the procession. At the place of execution, typically a scaffold erected in a public location for maximum visibility, the condemned was hanged by the neck, but not hanged until dead. Hanged until nearly dead, or until barely conscious, until the point where they were still alive but incapacitated. They were then taken down and emasculated, their private parts cut off and burned before their eyes. Then they were disemboweled, their entrails removed while they were still living, then beheaded. Then their body was cut into 4 parts, quartered, and the parts were distributed to different locations around the kingdom, to be displayed publicly as a warning to others who might contemplate similar treasons. The head was typically placed on a spike above a city gate, London Bridge being the most common location. This was the legal sentence. It was designed not merely to kill, but to annihilate, to destroy not just the person, but the integrity of their body, to deny them the dignity of a whole burial, which had significant theological implications in an age when bodily resurrection was taken literally as a matter of theology. The executions were carried out in 2 groups, the first 4 on January the 30th, 1606, and the second 4 on January the 31st. The location of the second day's executions was St. Paul's Churchyard, which had the advantage, from the government's perspective, of being both central and symbolically significant. The first day's group included Everard Digby, Robert Wintour, John Grant, and Thomas Bates. They died in the prescribed manner before crowds that had gathered for the spectacle. On the second day, the executions were carried out in the yard of the Old Palace of Westminster, significantly, very close to the place where the conspirators had planned to commit their crime. The second group included Ambrose Rookwood, Robert Keyes, Thomas Wintour, and Guy Fawkes. And here, at the very last moment, at the very bottom of everything, Guy Fawkes did something unexpected. The scaffold at Westminster had been constructed with a ladder leading up to it. The prisoner would climb the ladder, the noose would be placed around their neck, and then they would be turned off, dropped until near death before being cut down and subjected to the rest of the sentence. Guy Fawkes climbed the ladder. He reached the top, and then, whether by accident or by deliberate intention, we cannot say with certainty, though almost every account assumes intention, he fell or jumped from the ladder with such force that when the rope snapped taut, his neck broke. He was dead before he was cut down. Dead before the emasculation, before the disembowelment, before the quartering. He had, in his last act of will, denied the executioner the most horrific elements of what had been planned for him. He had cheated the law at the very end of its full payment. Whether this was deliberate or not, whether he leaped with full intention, or whether he simply slipped, it has become, in the centuries since, a final act that those who find something to admire in Guy Fawkes have seized upon as evidence of his character. The quiet courage of the man in the cellar, the refusal to break entirely under torture, the steady defiance throughout the interrogations, and then, at the very end, the jump. Chapter 5. Aftermath, Myths and Meaning. The Gunpowder Plot was over. The conspirators were dead. The government had survived. King James had survived. Parliament had survived. England remained Protestant. But the story was only beginning in a different sense, because the aftermath of the Gunpowder Plot shaped English history, English culture, and English attitudes toward religion, politics, and civil liberty for the next 2 centuries and beyond. The immediate political consequences were predictable. The Catholic community in England suffered the consequences of the plot, despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that the majority of English Catholics had had nothing to do with it. The recusancy laws were tightened again. New legislation specifically targeted Catholics, including acts that required Catholics to take oaths abjuring the Pope's authority and prohibiting them from certain professions, from living within a certain distance of London, and from appearing at court. The Jesuits, who were seen as the intellectual backbone of Catholic resistance, were subjected to renewed persecution. Father Garnet's execution in May 1606 was accompanied by a significant propaganda effort by the government to portray the Jesuits as the masterminds behind the plot, a narrative that was not entirely supported by the evidence, given that Garnet had actively tried to discourage the conspirators, but that served the government's purposes well. It is worth noting here that the broader English Catholic community, by and large, condemned the Gunpowder Plot. There were Catholic voices at the time, Catholic clergy and lay people, who argued clearly and publicly that the plot was immoral, that it violated Catholic teaching, that it had no justification in theology or in justice. Some of the most prominent Catholic nobles wrote to the king, expressing their horror and their loyalty. The Gunpowder Plot was not, in any meaningful sense, an expression of English Catholic opinion. It was the act of a small group of radicalized individuals who had convinced themselves that extraordinary circumstances justified extraordinary violence. The majority of English Catholics were as appalled as everyone else, and, perhaps, more frightened by the consequences for their community. The government knew this to some extent, but political persecution rarely makes fine distinctions between the guilty and the innocent, and the tightened laws fell on everyone who refused to attend Protestant services, regardless of whether they had any connection to the plot. the long-term consequences for English Catholics extended for generations. It was not until the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829, more than 200 years after the Gunpowder Plot, that English Catholics were allowed to sit in Parliament and hold most public offices. The legal disabilities imposed on Catholics in the wake of the plot, combined with existing restrictions, created a formal second-class status that persisted through the 17th and 18th centuries. The anti-Catholic sentiment that the plot helped to crystallize, the association of Catholicism with treason, with foreign influence, with violence against the state, became a durable feature of English Protestant culture. The annual celebration of the plot's failure, initially mandated by Parliament in a law passed in January 1606, which required churches to hold services of thanksgiving on the 5th of November every year, evolved over the centuries from a formal religious commemoration into the informal, populist celebration that is Bonfire Night as it exists today. The effigies burned on November the 5th bonfires were not always, historically, effigies of Guy Fawkes. At various points in history, effigies of unpopular popes or Catholic figures were burned. In some parts of England, the effigy was of the Pope rather than Fawkes for much of the 17th and 18th centuries. The shift to Fawkes as the central figure of the celebration came later, as the event became more about commemoration and spectacle than about active anti-Catholic sentiment. The Guy Fawkes mask, the pale, smiling, mustached face that has become a global symbol of anonymous resistance, is a 20th century development, originating with the graphic novel V for Vendetta by Alan Moore and David Lloyd, published in the 1980s, which used a stylized Guy Fawkes mask as the symbol of its anarchist vigilante protagonist. When the mask was adopted by the hacktivist collective Anonymous in the 2000s, and then by the Occupy movement and other protest movements around the world, it completed a remarkable transformation from the face of a Catholic terrorist who failed to a symbol of resistance against authority in general, stripped of its specific historical context. This transformation tells us something interesting about how historical memory works. Guy Fawkes started as a villain, as the face of a conspiracy that nearly destroyed the English government. He became, over the centuries, a kind of ambiguous figure, dangerous but bold, frightening but brave. And then, in the specific context of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, he became a symbol that people could project their own political discontents onto, stripped of the specific religious and political content of his actual life and choices. Robert Catesby, who was in almost every meaningful sense the driving force behind the plot, has never achieved the same symbolic status. His name is known to historians and enthusiasts, but not to the general public. The man who conceived the whole thing, who recruited the conspirators and sustained their commitment through more than a year of preparation, whose charisma and conviction held the conspiracy together, he died at Holbeche House, shot in the back, before he could be subjected to the legal theatre of trial and execution. He was denied, in a sense, the stage. He did not get the scaffold moment. There was no dramatic last act for the historical record to attach itself to. Let us take a moment to think about the broader historical context in which the Gunpowder Plot occurred, because it sits at a very particular juncture in European and British history. 1605 was a moment of extraordinary religious tension across the whole of Western Europe. The Protestant Reformation, which had begun with Martin Luther's posting of his 95 Theses in 1517, nearly 90 years before the Gunpowder Plot, had divided the continent in ways that were still generating violence and instability. The French wars of religion had torn France apart for much of the second half of the 16th century, killing hundreds of thousands of people. The Dutch revolt against Spanish rule, partly a religious conflict between Protestant Dutch and Catholic Spanish, had been going on for decades. The 30 Years' War, which would begin in 1618 and devastate Central Europe for 3 decades, killing perhaps a third of the population of some German territories, was already gathering its preconditions. In this context, the Gunpowder Plot was not an isolated incident of religious extremism. It was part of a broader European pattern of religiously motivated political violence that was a defining feature of the era. And it should be understood not simply as the act of madmen or villains, but as the desperate culmination of decades of persecution experienced by a specific community of people who had been given very few peaceful options. This is not to excuse what the conspirators planned to do, the intended mass killing, the explosion that would have killed not just the king and the Protestant nobility, but servants, guards, bystanders, and any Catholic peers who happened to be present, was monstrous by any reasonable moral standard, ancient or modern. The conspirators' casual willingness to kill a great many people in pursuit of their political and religious goals is not rendered acceptable by the genuine injustices they had suffered, but understanding the injustices they had suffered matters. It matters because historical literacy requires us to understand not just what people did, but why they did it, to understand the world that made them, the choices available to them, the calculations they made, and the desperation that drove those calculations. The Gunpowder Plotters were not simply evil. They were men who had grown up in a world that treated them as second-class subjects, who had watched their families impoverished and their priests executed, who had tried conventional means of seeking relief and found every door closed, and who had ultimately convinced themselves that extraordinary violence was the only remaining option. The tragedy of the Gunpowder Plot is not just that it failed. It is that it was conceived in the first place, that the persecution of English Catholics had gone on long enough and been severe enough to produce men capable of planning this kind of attack. The tragedy is that the response to the plot, the tightening of anti-Catholic laws, the intensification of persecution, made the underlying situation worse rather than better, ensuring that the grievances that produced the conspiracy would continue to fester for generations. The men of the Gunpowder Plot were not heroes. They were not freedom fighters in any meaningful sense. Their vision of liberation was the imposition of a different religious tyranny, not the establishment of religious freedom. They would not have replaced Protestant persecution of Catholics with genuine tolerance. They would have replaced it with Catholic persecution of Protestants. But they were also not cartoon villains. They were human beings, flawed, frightened, desperate, sometimes brave, sometimes cruel, capable of friendship and faith and loyalty, as well as of terrible violence. They deserve to be understood in their full complexity, not flattened into a simple story of evil thwarted. Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury, emerged from the Gunpowder Plot with his position enormously strengthened. The plot had, from the government's perspective, been a kind of gift, a dramatic, terrifying conspiracy that, by being uncovered at the last moment, demonstrated the vigilance and providence that protected the king and the kingdom. Cecil had managed the response brilliantly, whether or not he had advanced knowledge of the plot, and his control of the subsequent investigation and trials gave him complete command of the narrative. King James, for his part, was, according to contemporary accounts, genuinely terrified by the narrow escape. He reportedly suffered from recurring nightmares about the plot for some time afterward. Whether this trauma deepened his hostility toward Catholics, or whether it was simply the latest in a series of experiences that had made him afraid, he had, after all, grown up in Scotland amid plots and counterplots, had survived the Gowrie conspiracy of 1600, and had lost his mother to politically motivated execution, is difficult to say, but it did not make him more lenient. The physical evidence of the plot, the Undercroft, the barrels, the slow match found on Guy Fawkes, was carefully preserved and displayed. The Gunpowder Plot became, within weeks of its discovery, the subject of sermons, pamphlets, broadsides, and ballads. The government's version of events, providential deliverance, loyal subjects, barbaric Catholic traitors, was disseminated as widely and quickly as the communications technology of the period allowed. That version of events has, in many ways, persisted. The story that most people in England learn, or learned, before the curriculum shifted in recent decades, is fundamentally the government story. Guy Fawkes is the villain. The king was saved. God protected England. The more complicated story, the decades of persecution, the recusancy laws, the priest holes, the executions, the ruinous fines, the genuine desperation that drove these men to their terrible plan, is less prominent in popular memory. It requires a willingness to complicate the simple narrative of saved versus villainous, and that kind of complication is always harder to sustain than a clear moral tale. Let us return, for a moment, to the physical spaces of this story, to the cold stone of the Undercroft beneath the House of Lords, to the cramped darkness of the priest holes in the manor houses of the Midlands, to the tower cells where men were broken and questioned, to the scaffold where they died. These places are all, in their way, testaments to what happens when a state decides that a particular group of its people are permanent suspects, that their faith makes them inherently untrustworthy, inherently dangerous, inherently other. The priest holes were built because priests needed somewhere to hide. The Gunpowder Plot was conceived because the people who built the priest holes had run out of places to hide. There is a line that runs from the Act of Supremacy of 1534 to the scaffold in Westminster on January the 31st, 1606. It is a long line and a complicated one, and it passes through many different people making many different choices. Henry VIII chose to break with Rome. Elizabeth chose to impose the recusancy laws. James chose to reimpose them. The conspirators chose to respond with violence. Cecil chose to manage the response in ways that served his own power, and generations of ordinary English Catholics chose, mostly, to endure. The ones we remember are the ones who chose differently. We remember Catesby and Fawkes. We remember them because their choice was dramatic, because it nearly succeeded, because it was discovered in a way that made a great story, because it produced a tradition of bonfires and fireworks that has outlasted everyone involved. We remember them too because history has a tendency to remember the dramatic and the violent over the patient and the enduring. For every Catesby who raised his hand against the state, there were hundreds of Catholics who went to Mass in secret. who hid their priests, who paid their fines, who watched their children grow up in quiet defiance of a law that denied their humanity. We do not have their stories in the same way. They left fewer documents. They made less noise. They did not blow anything up. But they were there, and they were, in their own way, just as much a part of this story as the men in the cellar with the gunpowder. We should also spend a moment on the question of what the Gunpowder Plot tells us about intelligence and statecraft in the early 17th century. Because whether you believe that Robert Cecil had prior knowledge of the plot or not, the government's handling of the whole affair was remarkably effective. The conspiracy was uncovered through whatever combination of luck, intelligence work, and deliberate strategy before it could succeed. The conspirators were identified, hunted down, tried, and executed with relative efficiency. The political consequences were managed in a way that strengthened rather than destabilized the government. Cecil had learned well from his father, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, who had been Elizabeth's chief minister for most of her reign, and who had constructed one of the most effective domestic intelligence networks in Europe. The Elizabethan and Jacobean state was, in this respect, ahead of many of its contemporaries. It had developed sophisticated systems for monitoring potential threats, for managing informers, for intercepting correspondence, and for turning conspiracies into political opportunities. The Walsingham Network, the intelligence operation run by Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's Secretary of State, in the 1570s and 80s, had been particularly effective. It had uncovered the Ridolfi Plot of 1571, the Throckmorton Plot of 1583, and the Babington Plot of 1586, the last of which had provided the evidence that led to the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. By the time of the Gunpowder Plot, the English government had nearly 4 decades of experience in dealing with Catholic conspiracies, and it showed. This context makes some historians even more suspicious about the government's claim to have been taken by surprise by the plot. A state security apparatus that had successfully uncovered 3 major conspiracies over 2 decades, that had extensive informant networks within the Catholic community, that was led by a minister, Cecil, whose father had built that apparatus and who had inherited all of its capabilities. This state was really taken completely by surprise by a conspiracy that had been running for more than a year, and that involved 13 people. The skepticism is understandable, but skepticism is not proof, and the historical consensus remains that while the government may have had earlier warning than the official account admits, there is no definitive evidence of a complete government fabrication of the kind the most extreme conspiracy theories require. I want to close this episode by talking about legacy. Not the political legacy of the plot, we have covered that, but the personal legacies, the people. Robert Catesby's family suffered badly after the plot. His son Robert was sequestered, his lands and property were taken by the crown. The Catesby family name, which had been distinguished in the English Catholic gentry for generations, was permanently associated with treason. Catesby himself was posthumously attainted. The legal declaration of treason was applied to his memory and estate. His body, which had been buried at Holbeche House after his death, was exhumed by government order so that his head could be removed and displayed on the gates of Parliament in London. The standard treatment for executed traitors applied retroactively to a man who had died by a musket ball rather than the scaffold. Thomas Wintour died on the scaffold on January the the 31st, 1606. He had written a detailed confession during his imprisonment that is one of the most important primary sources for the history of the plot, a clear-eyed, unflinching account of the conspiracy from its inception that does not minimize his own role and makes no attempt to shift blame. He wrote it knowing it would be used to condemn him. Everard Digby's execution was, by contemporary accounts, the most emotionally affecting of the group. He was young, wealthy, idealistic, and had a wife and 2 young children who survived him. He had written a final letter to his wife from the Tower that has been preserved, a letter of genuine tenderness and grief, expressing his love for her and his belief that he would see her in heaven. He died on January the 30th. Robert Keyes was described in contemporary accounts as having made the most dignified death of the group on the first day, standing on the gallows with apparent composure and making a brief, composed statement before he was turned off. Thomas Bates, Catesby's servant, the man who had been brought into the conspiracy because he had guessed too much, was the most peripheral of the conspirators, and in some ways the most pitiable. He had not been a gentleman, had not been a man of independent means or standing, had followed his master into a conspiracy, the full dimensions of which he may not have fully understood, and died with the others on January the 30th. Guy Fawkes, as we have discussed, died on January the 31st. His jump from the scaffold ladder, whether deliberate or not, denied the executioners their full performance. His body was quartered and the parts distributed, as was customary. His name became the most famous of all the conspirators, attached to the whole plot through the vicissitudes of historical memory. He would not have been pleased, probably, to know that his face would one day be sold as a plastic mask in novelty shops, or that people would burn effigies of him in their back gardens every November while letting off fireworks and eating toffee apples. He was a soldier. He was a man of faith. He sat in a cellar beneath Parliament with 36 barrels of gunpowder and waited for the order to light the fuse. That is the thing he chose to do with his life. That is the thing history remembers him for. Let me leave you with a thought about memory and anniversary. Every year on the 5th of November, in towns and villages across England, bonfires are lit, fireworks are set off. Children hold sparklers and watch the sky. The specific religious content of the occasion, the Protestant celebration of deliverance from Catholic treachery, has largely faded. Most people who attend bonfire night celebrations do not think about recusancy laws or priest holes or the specific theology that made 36 barrels of gunpowder seem like a reasonable response to political persecution. They are there for the fire and the lights and the warmth against the November cold. But the event persists. 420 years after Guy Fawkes was found in that cellar, England still lights fires on his night. The rhyme still gets repeated. Remember, remember, the 5th of November. The names of the plot, Catesby, Percy, Fawkes, are still, at some level, part of the cultural furniture of England. History is strange in this way. The things that stick are not always the most important things. They are the most dramatic things, the most visceral things, the things that produced a good story. The Gunpowder Plot produced a very good story. It had a secret plan and a charismatic leader and a technically skilled operative in a dark cellar and a mysterious anonymous letter and a last-minute search and a defiant interrogation and a final leap from a scaffold. It was, in the language of storytelling, extremely well structured for a real event. The people who lived it were not thinking about how their story would be told 4 centuries later. They were thinking about survival and justice and faith and loyalty and what it meant to do right by their community in a world that had made doing right almost impossibly difficult. They made their choices, some of them terrible choices, choices that cannot be defended and should not be celebrated in the context of a world we can understand intellectually but not quite feel in our bones. A world where your religion could kill you, where your priest hid in your walls, where the state watched and counted and fined and sometimes executed. But the human story that lies beneath the Gunpowder Plot, the story of a minority community that has been pushed too far and has produced, among its most desperate members, people willing to resort to extreme violence, is not a story that belongs only to 1605. It is a story that recurs. It is a story about what happens when a state refuses to see part of its population as fully human, fully loyal, fully deserving of equal treatment under the law. It is a story about radicalization, about the long, slow process by which years of injustice transform a man of faith into a man of violence. Understanding that story, understanding it in its full complexity, without excusing the violence or erasing the injustice, is, perhaps, the most important reason to remember the Gunpowder Plot at all. Not to celebrate Guy Fawkes, not to celebrate the government that stopped him, but to understand what brought both sides to that cellar, the state with its searchers and lanterns, the conspirator with his matches and touchwood, and to ask what it means and what it costs, and what might have been different. And so we reach the end of this episode of Sleepless History. We have been through quite a journey tonight, from the reign of Henry VIII and the breaking of England with Rome, through the 45 years of Elizabeth's reign and the grinding years of recusancy laws and priest holes and fines and executions, through the false dawn of James I's succession and the slamming shut of that window of hope, through the assembly of 13 men in a house near the Strand in London and the long, anxious months of preparation and secrecy, through the Undercroft and the 36 barrels of gunpowder and the Monteagle letter and the midnight search and the matches in the pocket, through the interrogation in the Tower and the defiant responses and the slowly diminishing signatures, through the ride to the Midlands and the rain and the wet gunpowder and the fire at Holbeche House and the deaths of Catesby and Percy and the Wright brothers, through the trials at Westminster and the scaffold and the final jump of Guy Fawkes on January the 31st, 1606. Sleep well. This has been Sleepless History.